A routine arrest takes a turn no one saw coming when a cop brings in a woman he's convinced is a fraud, only to realize too late that she holds more power than he ever could. What happens when the one you try to bring down is the one who decides your fate? Let us know in the comments section below. The dull fluorescent lights in the precinct buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to be annoying. Officer Brad Simmons leaned back in his chair, sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup, eyes scanning the half-empty bullpen like a king surveying his dull, insignificant kingdom. His shift had been quiet. Too quiet. No one to put in their place, no one to remind of the natural order. And then, as if the universe had heard his silent complaint, his radio crackled to life. Suspicious individual at Clover Diner. Possible fraud situation. White female, mid-30s, presenting questionable identification. Brad's lip curled. Another scammer, no doubt. Maybe someone using a stolen credit card, maybe some junkie trying to run a tab they couldn't pay. He lived for these moments, the ones where he got to show people they weren't as clever as they thought they were. He grabbed his jacket and strode out the door. The Clover Diner was the kind of place that smelled like burnt toast and too much bacon grease. A relic of a time when waitresses still called customers hun and coffee came in thick ceramic mugs that never saw the inside of a dishwasher. She was sitting in a corner booth, completely at ease, a half-empty cup of coffee beside her, scrolling through her phone like she hadn't just been accused of a crime. Brad took one look at her and knew. The sharp jawline, the broad shoulders softened by time, the hands, delicate but just a little too large for a woman her size. He'd seen it before. Seen people like her before. Transgender. He felt something ugly coil in his stomach. For a moment, he almost laughed. Of course, it had to be one of them. The waitress, a frazzled woman in her late 40s, motioned him over. She's using a credit card that don't match her ID, officer. Won't even show a second form. Brad crossed his arms. That true? The woman in front of him lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes with a calm, almost amused expression. I don't show extra ID for people who don't need to see it, she said. It's my card. You can call the bank and check. Her voice was smooth, controlled, like someone used to being in charge. It irritated him. That's so? Brad sneered. You think you get to decide how this works? Her lips pressed together, the amusement fading into something more measured. I think I know the law better than you do. He hated the way she said it, like she wasn't afraid of him. Like she knew something he did. Stand up. She let out a small sigh, as if he was nothing more than an inconvenience. Then slowly she slid out of the booth, standing to her full height. Not much shorter than him, actually. Brad's fingers twitched toward his cuffs. Hands behind your back. For the first time, something flickered across her face. Not fear, but something close to disappointment. You sure you want to do this? She asks. That was it, the last push. Brad grabbed her arm, yanked it behind her back, and snapped on the cuffs. I know exactly what I'm doing, he said. But later, much later, when he stood in a courtroom staring at the woman he thought he had power over, he would wonder if that had been the biggest lie he had ever told. The ride to the station was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made Brad Simmons uncomfortable. Usually when people got tossed into the back of his cruiser, they had something to say, pleading, bargaining, cursing, anything to try and claw back control of the situation. But not this woman. Bailey Swanner sat in the backseat, her hands cuffed in front of her, staring out the window like she was enjoying a casual Sunday drive. Not a trace of fear, no hint of panic. That smug calmness grated on him more than if she'd been screaming. He checked her ID again. Bailey Swanner, 36, local address, credit card in her name. And it didn't make sense. If she was scamming people, where was the proof? If she was lying, why wasn't she fighting harder? He clenched his jaw and focused on the road. It didn't matter. He was bringing her in. At a red light, he glanced in the rearview mirror. She was watching him, not with anger, not with fear, just a quiet, steady look like she was waiting for him to figure something out. He gripped the wheel a little tighter. Oh, you don't seem too worried, he muttered. She blinked, slow and deliberate. Should I be? Brad scoffed. You tell me. Bailey tilted her head slightly. You ever arrest someone without knowing what for? His grip on the wheel tightened. Fraud, he said through clenched teeth. Her eyebrow lifted. Is it? Brad hated this, the way she talked, the way she... Didn't sound like a person being dragged into custody, but more like she was humoring him. Like she knew something he didn't. He faced forward. We'll see what the judge has to say about that. Bailey didn't respond. She just smiled. The precinct smelled like old coffee and stress. Brad marched Bailey inside, keeping a firm grip on her arm, as if expecting her to suddenly bolt. But she didn't resist, didn't struggle. She walked with the same quiet confidence she'd had at the diner, her chin lifted slightly, her back straight. That bugged him. Most people slumped under the weight of an arrest. Most people crumbled a little when they realized they weren't the ones in control anymore. Not her. She held herself like she still had the upper hand. And Brad was starting to hate that. "Booking," he barked to the officer at the front desk. Officer Reynolds, a tired-looking man with graying temples, barely glanced up from his paperwork. "Charges?" Brad stiffened. He hadn't actually figured that part out yet. "She was using a card that didn't match her ID," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. Reynolds raised an unimpressed eyebrow. "And?" Brad felt his patience snap. "And that's fraud," he said sharply. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You confirm that?" Brad hesitated for half a second too long. Bailey didn't. "You can call the bank," she said, her tone dry. "The card's mine." Brad shot her a glare. Reynolds exhaled, already looking annoyed. "Did you check the name?" Brad's jaw clenched. "It's a man's name." The room went quiet. Reynolds finally looked at Bailey. Bailey smiled. "I'm transgender." Reynolds didn't react. He just looked back at Brad, his face unreadable. "So let me get this straight. You arrested her because her old name was on her credit card." Brad felt heat creep up his neck. "She refused to show a second ID," he said. Bailey shrugged. "Because I don't need to." Brad glared at her, but Reynolds just let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Simmons," he muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Tell me you didn't—" "I followed procedure," Brad snapped. She what?" Reynolds cut in. "Sat in a diner and paid for her meal?" Brad's nostrils flared. He didn't like this. Didn't like the way it was turning. Didn't like the way he was suddenly the one on trial. "Put her in holding," he bit out. Reynolds hesitated. Bailey didn't. "That won't be necessary," she said smoothly. Brad turned to her, his patience worn thin. "You don't get to decide that—" Bailey held his gaze. "Neither do you." And before he could open his mouth to argue, she turned to Reynolds. "I'd like to make my phone call now." There was something in her voice, something that made Reynolds blink, straighten, and then nod a little too quickly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, of course." He uncuffs her. Brad bristled. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded. Reynolds ignored him, leading Bailey toward the back office. And just before the door closed behind her, she turned and met Brad's eyes. That same calm, knowing look. Like she already knew how this was going to end. Like she already knew exactly what was coming next. Brad paced outside the holding room, arms crossed, jaw clenched so tight it hurt. This was supposed to be easy. A simple arrest, a routine booking, another case that would barely make a dent in his day. But something was off. Bailey Swanner wasn't acting like someone in trouble. She wasn't begging, panicking, or demanding a lawyer like most people did when they realized they were in deep. She was waiting, like she knew exactly what was coming. The door to the office opened and Reynolds stepped out looking even more tired than before. "Did she make her call?" Brad asked, trying to sound indifferent. Reynolds gave him a long, unreadable look. "Yeah," he said. She did." Brad waited for more, but Reynolds just shook his head and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Brad's stomach twisted. This wasn't right. Something was coming. Something big, and he had a feeling he wasn't going to like it. The phone rang 3 times before the judge answered. It was like past office hours, past the time when anyone important should still be picking up. But this wasn't just anyone. "Judge Reynolds speaking," came the voice, firm but slightly groggy. Bailey smiled. "Good evening, Your Honor. I apologize for the late call." There was a beat of silence, then a sharp inhale. "Bailey," in the flesh. Another pause, then a low chuckle. "I assume this isn't a social call?" Bailey's gaze flickered toward the closed door. where she could still hear the distant sound of Simmons pacing. "I need a favor," she said. The judge sighed. "You in trouble," Bailey chuckled. "Not the way you think." Another pause, then a shift in tone. "What do you need?" Bailey leaned back in the chair, completely at ease. "I need you to arrange my immediate release." A sharp exhale, then, "What the hell happened?" Bailey's smile didn't fade. "A cop made a mistake," she said. Brad was halfway through his fourth lap around the precinct when the call came in. He watched as Reynolds picked up the phone, listened for a few seconds, then suddenly stiffened. His face went pale, his lips pressing into a thin line. And then slowly he turned his gaze toward Brad. Something in Brad's stomach dropped. Reynolds muttered a few more words into the receiver, nodded, then hung up. And the room was quiet, too quiet. Brad felt his pulse tick up. "What?" he demanded. Reynolds didn't say anything right away. Then finally, "She's free to go." Brad stared at him. "What?" Reynolds exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples like this was giving him a migraine. Judge ordered her release, effective immediately. Brad felt his blood pressure spike. "Are you serious?" Reynolds gave him a tired look. "Dead serious." Brad's hands curled into fists. No, this wasn't how this was supposed to go." People like her didn't win. People like her didn't just walk out of here. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Bailey stepped out of the holding room with the same calm expression she'd had since the diner. Brad was waiting for her. She looked surprised. Brad stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Who the hell are you?" Bailey met his gaze without flinching. "Bailey Swanner." Brad's nostrils flared. "Don't play games with me." Bailey tilted her head slightly. "I'm not." Brad's hands flexed at his sides. "How'd you do it?" Bailey smiled. "Simple." She took a slow step forward, lowering her voice just enough to make him lean in. "I know the law," she murmured, "better than you do." Brad's skin prickled with something he couldn't name. Bailey straightened, smoothing down her blouse like she hadn't just obliterated his entire sense of control. Then she turned to Reynolds. "Am I free to go?" Reynolds hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Yeah." Bailey smiled like this was all just another day in her life. And then she walked past Brad without another word. Brad stood there, watching her go, feeling something gnawing at the back of his mind. Something wasn't right. Something big was coming. And for the first time in his career, he had no idea what to do about it. Brad Simmons had arrested plenty of people before. People who fought, people who cried, people who begged. But none of them had ever walked out of the precinct like they owned the place. Bailey Swanner she didn't run, didn't scurry, didn't even glance back to see if he was coming after her. She just walked out like she had every right to be there, every right to leave. And the worst part, she did. Brad's pulse was still hammering by the time she disappeared out the front door. He couldn't move, couldn't think. He had never been in a situation where he wasn't the one in control. But now, standing there, watching her leave without a care in the world, he felt it slipping. He turned on Reynolds. Who the hell was on the phone? Reynolds leaned against the desk, rubbing his temples. "The judge..." Brett shook his head. "That fast? Who even is she?" Reynolds sighed. "You should probably sit down." Brad ignored that. "No, I should probably know what's going on." Reynolds glanced at him, then at the door Bailey had just walked through. "You ever hear the name Swanner before?" Brad's brow furrowed. "Should I?" Reynolds coughed. "Yeah, you should have." He pushed himself off the desk and crossed the room to the old filing cabinets that never got used anymore, yanking open a drawer. He pulled out a thick folder, flipped through a few pages, then smacked it down on the desk in front of Brad. "Take a look." Brad hesitated, then reached for it. The first thing he saw was a photo. Bailey Swanner. But this wasn't a mugshot. It wasn't a driver's license. It was an official portrait. And at the bottom, in bold, unmistakable print, Assistant United States. Attorney. Brad's mouth went dry. "No," he muttered. Reynolds gave him a knowing look. "Oh, yeah." Brad flipped the page, his fingers suddenly unsteady. Case files, court documents. high-profile prosecutions. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was a federal prosecutor. Brad's stomach twisted. He had arrested a federal prosecutor for nothing. His mind scrambled, trying to find an out, some loophole, some way to make this go away. But there wasn't one. "She's the reason Judge Reynolds picked up the phone," Reynolds said. "You don't ignore a call from someone like her." Brad swallowed hard. "This has to be a mistake." Reynolds huffed a laugh. "Yeah, and you made it." Brad clenched his fists, his mind racing. "No," he repeated, more to himself than anyone else. "No, this doesn't change anything." Reynolds arched an eyebrow. Doesn't it?" Brad straightened. "She won't do anything. She can't. It's a conflict of interest or something." Reynolds shook his head. "She doesn't have to. You embarrass yourself, Simmons. You made the kind of mistake that people remember." Brad took a step back. "I was doing my job." Reynolds stared at him. "Your job?" Brad said nothing. Reynolds leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Your job was to uphold the law. Instead, you walked into a diner and arrested someone because, what? Her credit card didn't match the name you thought it should have?" Brad's nostrils flared. "I had cause." "No, you didn't," Reynolds shook his head, "and you know it." Brad felt his throat tighten. She had known. From the second he put the cuffs on her, she had known. That was why she hadn't fought. That was why she had smiled. That was why she had made the damn phone call so calmly, like she was ordering takeout. Because she had already won. And now he was the one sweating. Brad turned toward the door like he could still catch her, still stop this from happening. Reynolds sighed. "If I were you, I'd start thinking about my next move." Brad turned back to him. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Reynolds met his gaze. "You think she's just going to let this slide?" Brad didn't answer. Reynolds didn't need him to. Because they both knew the truth. Bailey Swanner wasn't done with him. Not even close. Brad Simmons sat stiffly in the courtroom, hands clasped together so tight his knuckles were white. This wasn't where he was supposed to be. He belonged out there, standing in front of the bench, testifying, running the show, not here, not on the other side of things, not as the one being judged. The entire room buzzed with quiet murmurs. Reporters sat in the back, cameras waiting. A few of his fellow officers were in the gallery, some exchanging quiet glances, others refusing to look at him at all. The air was thick with something unspoken, something heavy. Brad didn't want to be here, but he didn't have a choice. Because the woman he had arrested, the woman he had humiliated, was about to walk through those doors, and when she did, his entire world would shift. He had spent his career treating people like her as less than, like they were jokes, inconveniences, things to be dealt with rather than respected. And now Bailey Swanner was about to remind him exactly who she was. The door to the judge's chamber opened, and there she was. Bailey walked in with the same quiet confidence she'd had the night he arrested her. She wasn't wearing the casual outfit from the diner anymore. This time, she was in a tailored black suit, sharp and commanding. The kind of thing worn by someone who knew they had already won before the game even started. Brad felt something twist in his stomach. She wasn't smiling. That was worse than if she had been. She approached the prosecution's table and set down her briefcase. She didn't rush, didn't make any unnecessary movements. Every step, every action was deliberate. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. "Court is now in session." The murmurs died down, the tension in the room coiled tighter. Haley didn't sit. She turned, locking eyes with Brad. He swallowed hard. Then she spoke. "Your Honor," she said, her voice crisp, unwavering. "The defendant before you today is Officer Bradley Simmons, an officer with a documented history of targeting and discriminating against marginalized individuals, particularly those within the LGBTQ+ community." Brad felt a jolt go through him. She wasn't wasting time. Last week, Officer Simmons unlawfully detained me on baseless charges, despite my compliance, despite my rights, despite the fact that he had no legal reason to do so. He assumed I was a criminal, not because of my actions, but because of his own prejudices. Brad's pulse pounded in his ears. Bailey turned back to the judge. "And let's be clear, Your Honor, this is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern, one that has gone unchecked for too long. Brad's hands curled into fists beneath the table. This couldn't be happening, but it was. Bailey reached into her briefcase, pulled out a thick file, and handed it to the judge. This is a compiled list of complaints filed against Officer Simmons over the past 6 years, reports of harassment, of unnecessary force, of clear and blatant bias, and yet nothing was done, not once. Judge Reynolds took the file and flipped through it, his expression darkening. Bailey's voice remained steady. The question before this court is simple. Should an officer who repeatedly abuses his authority be allowed to continue wearing a badge? Brad gritted his teeth. This is a damn witch hunt. Bailey turned her gaze back to him. Is it? He felt his blood boil. I did my job. Her eyes flashed. No, you didn't. Her voice, still controlled, cut through the air like a blade. Your job is to uphold the law, she said, not to enforce your personal opinions, not to use your badge as a weapon against people who don't fit into your narrow worldview. You don't get to decide who is and isn't worthy of respect. The law does. Brad felt every eye in the courtroom on him. Bailey took a slow step closer. And the law is why you're here today. Silence. Judge Reynolds looked down at the file again, then exhaled. We will take a brief recess before proceeding. The gavel struck. The court was dismissed. But Brad Simmons knew. For him, this was only the beginning. Brad Simmons sat frozen in his chair, feeling the weight of the courtroom press down on him. His entire career, his entire life, boiled down to this moment. He could hear the rustling of papers, the hush whispers of the courtroom, but his mind was a blur of static. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had always been the one with power. The one who made the decisions, the one who walked into a room and knew he was in control. Not today. Today, he was just a man waiting to hear if everything he had built would crumble beneath him. The judge re-entered the courtroom, taking his seat. The murmurs quieted. The tension became suffocating. Bailey Swanner sat at the prosecution's table, perfectly composed, hands folded neatly in front of her. She hadn't looked at him once since her statement. She didn't need to. The damage had been done. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. Officer Simmons, this court has reviewed the evidence brought forth regarding your conduct in the past several years, as well as your actions on the night of Ms. Swanner's unlawful arrest. Based on the complaints filed, the testimonies presented, and the clear abuse of authority displayed, it is this court's decision that you be removed from duty effective immediately. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Furthermore, the judge continued, flipping through the file in front of him, a formal inquiry will be launched into the policies of this precinct to determine how repeated violations of civil rights were allowed to persist under your watch. The room remained silent, but Brad could feel the shift happening. It wasn't just his badge on the line. This was bigger than him now. He gritted his teeth. This is a damn joke, he muttered under his breath. Bailey finally turned her head. I'm sorry, she said, her tone calm but firm. Did you say something? He glared at her, the anger rolling off him in waves. Yeah, I did. You think you won? You think this changes anything? This whole system is a joke. Bailey studied him for a long moment. Then she gave the smallest shake of her head. This was never about me winning, she said quietly. It was about making sure you couldn't keep hurting people. Brad opened his mouth to snap back, but something stopped him. For the first time since he'd walked into this room, he had nothing to say. The gavel struck, court is adjourned. And just like that, it was over. Brad felt his stomach churn as people began filing out of the courtroom. Some reporters were already jotting down notes, no doubt preparing headlines about the disgraced officer. Some of his former colleagues kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Others didn't bother hiding their relief. He had spent years believing himself untouchable. Today, he learned otherwise. Bailey stepped outside, inhaling deeply as the fresh air hit her. The tension in her shoulders finally started to ease. She hadn't wanted any of this. She hadn't planned for it, but it had needed to happen. A small voice called out behind her. Swanner! She turned to see a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, approaching her. Hesitantly at first, then faster. She had wide, nervous eyes and was gripping the strap of her bag tightly. Bailey smiled. Yes. The woman swallowed, looking down for a second before glancing back up. I wanted to say thank you. Bailey tilted her head. For what? The woman let out a shaky breath. For standing up to him, for standing up to people like him, she exhaled. I'm trans, and I've had run-ins with cops like him before, but no one ever believes us when we say what happens. No one ever listens. Bailey's chest tightened. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on the young woman's shoulder. They're listening now. The woman nodded, looking on the verge of tears, but this time it wasn't from fear. Bailey gave her shoulder a squeeze. Keep going, she said softly. Keep fighting. We're not invisible. The woman nodded again, a little stronger this time. Bailey watched as she walked away, disappearing into the city streets. She turned her face to the sun, letting it warm her skin. She had spent years proving herself, fighting to exist in spaces that weren't built for her, fighting to be seen. And today she had won more than just a case. Today she had made it clear they weren't going anywhere, and the world would just have to keep up.